Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Chris Treece. His last name is spelled Treece. And he just published a book this year. Title of it is Crazy Ambulance Tales. And you can find it on Amazon. Right now, it has 99 five-star ratings. And, you can get a Kindle, hardcover, or paperback of the book. And his full website, you can see more about the book and him, is crazyambulancetales.com. But he has worn many working hats as a ditch digger, day laborer, gas station attendant, rappelling instructor, Boy Scout camp quartermaster, emergency medical technician, hospital orderly, Universal Studios tour guide, grip, production assistant, videographer, soundman, nightly TV news crew, newspaper and magazine journalist, Emmy award-winning PBS TV writer, producer, director of documentaries, Hollywood comedy and adventure screenwriter, and an award-winning public relations, communications, and marketing director, and as the dancing cow at the Enosburg Falls Dairy Festival. He's a former resident of the charming state of Vermont, and he lives right now in the storytelling capital of the world in Southern California with his wife and many children. But again, we're going to talk about this book. Really interesting. I got halfway through, and you see from the inside, some of these personalities you see driving around on the ambulance are, flesh and blood people. So you hear a lot of those stories from this book. Again, it's Crazy Ambulance Tales by Chris Treece. So, Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, for people who may not have heard your name, you've worn a lot of different working hats. It says you're an Emmy award-winning writer, and the book is excellently written. I recommend it. Can you kind of talk about your background and what led you up to publishing Crazy Ambulance Tales in 2022?
Sure. So, I grew up in a rural mountain valley of middle-class homes, burbling streams, chirping birds, peace, security, and order. And it was a great place to have a childhood, and I was bored out of my mind as a teenager there. And all I wanted to do was to get out of all that peace, security, and order and go have adventures somewhere. So I had relatives who were cops, or one was a military medic. I had friends who were sheriffs or who were in search and rescue squads, and they used to regale me with tales of their adventures. And so as a young man, when I had the opportunity to get into EMS, I leapt at it.
So you started off pretty young. I was surprised about how young the people in the full rig really were. They're all just post high school, at least in your time, pretty young people comparatively. Would you agree with that?
Sure. So I was 18 when I started. So I think a lot of people in the United States have an image in their minds of, EMS professionals in an urban or suburban setting. The reality is 50% of the EMTs in the US are volunteer and usually rural, and 67% of firefighters in the US are volunteers. So, the typical EMT paramedic is not just a solidly built dude in a fire coat, but it's also a 45-year-old married woman who works as a postal clerk and who's been serving her town for 20 years as an EMT and is probably really great and has saved a lot of lives. So I moved to New England to go to college, and it was there that I joined a volunteer fire department at the age of 18. And I can tell you a little bit more about that if you'd like to hear something about St. Mike's, or first, maybe we could touch on the history of EMS in the US and what a dangerous place it was to get into a car accident before 1970.
Please do, yes.
So I learned a lot of this sitting at the feet of my fire and rescue elders. And I find these tales fascinating because before the interstate highway system was built, which happened, after probably late 50s, continuing on until the early 70s, it was a really dangerous place in the US to get in a car accident. So if you were in a car accident at that time, your relatives put you on the back of a door and slid it onto a pickup truck and drove to the local cottage hospital. They might trundle you into the back of a car, causing more injuries, and take you to the hospital. Or you would wait for the undertaker to show up. And in Vermont, the undertaker was affiliated with your religious denomination. So if you were lying bleeding on the street, if you were Catholic, you waited for the Catholic undertaker to show up. Or if you were Methodist, you waited for the Methodist. And if one of those undertakers was doing a funeral or hauling a corpse, they might not get to you right away. So this, this blows people's minds when they hear this. And I was talking with an old time friend of mine who's a newspaper reporter from Burlington, Vermont. He was telling me about a story that he read in the archives from the mid 60s of 5 people in a car accident who were lying on the turf on the side of the road waiting for 5 coroners to show up, undertakers, to put them in the back of their hearses and haul them to the hospital. So this was not a great state of affairs. What happened when the interstate highway system was built is that people could start to kill themselves in dramatic high-speed ways. And the US government, I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek about that, the US government mandated money for EMS, for emergency medical services. A lot of the first ambulances were started up. And we also saw training for EMTs. And at that point, the standard of care in the United States shot up dramatically, and it became a much better place to be in a car accident.
Right. And so it's hard to believe that God was that. So you were in a rural environment in kind of northern Vermont working, right? Can you talk about what led you into that job and what it was like working there?
Sure. So I moved to Vermont to go to St. Michael's College, which is in Colchester, Vermont. It's a liberal arts school. And at St. Mike's in 1969, a student died on the playing field due to a lack of EMS care. So the dean of students, whose nickname was and still is Pappy, who was a former firefighter and a Navy veteran, got together with a bunch of long-haired, bell-bottom wearing students, and they started the first college-affiliated fire department in the United States. And I'll say that again. It was the very first college-affiliated fire department in the U.S. And interestingly enough, there's a bunch of them. There's a lot of them out there. University of Vermont has one as well. Anyway, St. Mike's was the first. And these long-haired students became EMTs. They bought an old school hearse-style ambulance. Must have been really tough to negotiate around in the back. They got themselves a pumper truck, and they started up service to the campus at first, and then to the local communities. And so soon they were serving 5 local towns with EMS care, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. And it's still happening now. So there are still St. Mike's students serving the community today. If you go to the website for www.crazyambulancetales.com, click on the St. Mike's page or click on the social media icons. I was on St. Mike's Facebook page on Thanksgiving, and there they were, these young people, ages 18 through 22, EMTs and firefighters. There was a shot of them looking, William, frankly, rather rumpled, gathered around their Thanksgiving turkey, and it said that they had finally caught a break that day and had time to eat their meal. So that's the organization that I was a part of. We celebrated our 50th anniversary this spring, and I'm very proud that it's still going.
That's amazing. And you had like a free room and board to work on this rig, right? Or you had some kind of benefit.
That's true. So summers we were offered free room and board to work on the ambulance, and that was a great deal. And I usually took them up on that.
And it wasn't. I mean, you had to do shifts, but it's kind of like a fireman. You wait around for the calls. Some days are more busy than others. Can you talk about what it was like working, one of the 12-hour shifts?
Sure. So these days there's 60 students involved in fire and rescue at St. Mike's. I think there's 30 on the fire unit and 30 on the ambulance unit. They actually have 2 rigs now. So we responded in my day to 3 calls a day. They respond now to 8 calls a day. So the call volume has gone up. On average, I ran, and most of the students on the rig in my day, since there were only 17 of us at that time on the ambulance unit, we ran 100 hours of duty a week. So that would be day and night. So you would sleep at the garage. I would sleep at the garage 3 nights a week in the bunk room. And then during the day, there was sort of a cobbled together shifts. Sometimes you would have a professor who wouldn't let you run duty during his class, but we had a lot of sympathetic professors. They would let us sit near the door. I would have a scanner or a pager on me with an earpiece. And then if I got a call, I would slip out the door and run over to the ambulance. So it was a great formation in that if you're doing 3 calls a day, you very quickly become very good at EMS. And, we were really privileged. I'm the black sheep of the family, frankly, the black sheep or the weird sheep of the EMS family. I didn't continue with a career in EMS. But
Hmm.
most of my colleagues from the rig are now working as cops, professional firefighters, paramedics, doctors. They work in community service at various state levels, positions of leadership, or they went into the military.
Wow. So that was it. And it is interesting, like you talked to a priest there who said it's going to change your life once you join this EMS or EMT crew or ECH crew. Can you talk about what life was like before and what life was like after manning the rig at St. Michael's?
Sure. So I walked out of Mass one day, Catholic Mass, and talked to Father Mike, who was a wonderful priest and just a very dear man. And I told him about my interest. I was a freshman. I had just come to the school, my interest in joining the fire and rescue squad. And he looked at me with great kindness and compassion. And he said, "It's a wonderful organization. They do tremendous good, but you need to be careful because a lot of people who join fire and rescue have trouble with their grades, or they lose all of their non-fire and rescue friends. So just, keep your eye out for that and know that that's a possibility." And, God bless them, because both of those things did become issues for me later. Not so much the grades. I always got good grades. I would bring a book with me in the back of the rig. And when we were in the hospital and the crew chief was writing the form, I'd be studying in the back. But I did reach a point, which I talk about later in the book, where I almost did lose all of my non-fire and rescue friends. And it was because when you see so much trauma, so much death, and so much human suffering, I think you reach a point where you can feel that the rest of the world simply doesn't understand you. And I think that a lot of firefighters and EMTs and cops go through this. And there can be a point where you sort of gather the wagons and decide that you're just going to kind of hang out with the folks who get you. So it was actually important for me not to do that, though, and to continue with my non-EMS relationships, partially because those relationships were one of the things that kept me sane. I needed the company of people who weren't in EMS, who were, quote, normal, to kind of balance me out.
Interesting. And that is a challenge. I mean, you write of people who got into going to the ambulance and didn't come back. Like, not everybody kind of made it, right? There was kind of this winnowing process. Would you agree with that?
Sure. So it was extremely difficult to get onto the squad, which is ironic because there were never enough of us, but maybe that's part of the reason. We always felt like we could use more members. But so to get on the ambulance, you had to take a semester-long emergency care attendant class. And once you had passed that, then you could go through tryouts, and they were very rigorous. You had a written exam, you had sort of verbal questions, you were presented with various scenarios. I recall in mine, there was a scenario where someone was choking, another where I had to do CPR on someone, another where there was a serious traumatic injury. And then after you went through that, you sat down in this kind of big room in front of a panel in an empty space, and then they grilled you. They would ask you difficult questions, and they wanted to see how you did under pressure, and if you could handle those kinds of questions. And of course, I have the famous story there about how they asked me if I'd ever saved a life, and I had to think about it. And I said, well, I saved a chicken, and that brought down the house. They weren't expecting that answer. But anyway, once I got on the squad, and if people passed that process, that winnowing process, most of them usually stayed. It was so difficult to get there that then they would do their squad training and then proceed from there into later, they would go on to the EMT class. And that was a year-long class that we would take at the University of Vermont.
Right. And I mean, there's a lot of camaraderie once you're kind of in a kind of elite unit. Like, you guys were very serious about the situation and the teamwork and things like that. Can you talk about what it was like, what the ranking was like in the ambulance, and how people work together on a wide variety of calls?
Sure. So we ran a 4-person crew. So there would be the driver, a crew chief. So the crew chief was responsible for all aspects of patient care. There was someone then who was called a third. So the third would take vitals like pulse, blood pressure, respirations, And they were also a backup crew chief, just in case we had more than one patient. And then there was the fourth. The fourth was a probationary member in training. And as I like to say, most fourths are useless to the man and beast. They are given a clipboard and instructed to take notes for the crew chief. But most of the time, the fourth is in so much shock at this new world that the notes come out to be absolute gibberish. You know, they do their best. But, you know, later when I became a crew chief, fourths would hand me notes that I just simply couldn't decipher. So oftentimes I would just simply take the clipboard from them and just have them help out. But it's a military-like environment. There's no discussion, you know, there's no consensus. The crew chief makes decisions, and those decisions are instantly obeyed by all the members of the crew. So that's the kind of situation that we would deal with. We would also do, you know, our training of various crew members. So people would train to become crew chiefs, so they would train to become drivers. And that was something that we would do as well. But the environment is so intense that the bonds that it creates among the crew members are remarkable. And I've had all sorts of comments, but one of the comments I got was that someone said to me, he was amazed at how many of us married each other. And, you know, it kind of makes sense that if you're working with other people and you see them, you know, handle life's worst situations with compassion and competence, you really get to know that person pretty well. And we have a lot of marriages that came out of Fire and Rescue Squad.
Right. It's like a huge bonding experience, right? Like you guys are, and there's some pretty harrowing events that you handle too, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, every day.
Can you talk? I mean, you have a different perspective. You have, you have a different perspective on car crashes now, don't you?
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, and it's too bad for my kids. You know, I've got great kids, but I have kids now that drive, and they really go. I put them through the ringer with a lot of stuff that they want to do. That I'm like, nope, no, you're not doing that. You're not going there. You know, nothing good happens after midnight because of everything that I've seen. So, yeah, it's a wild world, and it's one of the things that Brian in the book said to me about, you know, you get on the rig as a well-meaning kind of altruistic neophyte, and then as you go through the process of seeing how traumatic and brutal the world can be, you know, it changes you into a person who's, I think, a lot more careful, maybe sadder and wiser.
Right. Like you are one of the, like you're a front line. You see the deaths, you see the injury and harm, right? And so that's like a tough burden to carry. You would think a lot of you, I mean, I was surprised there weren't more. I've heard that within policemen, there's a lot of drinking, but that didn't seem to, how did you guys blow off steam, or how did you cope with the troubling deaths and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I have a chapter on that and talk about, you know, some of the ways we dealt with the stress. I would say, first of all, it helped that a lot of us had really good senses of humor. So I don't know that it immediately comes to mind when people think about cops or firefighters or EMTs. But in my experience, if you can handle that tremendous weight, you've got to have a release valve somewhere. And so a lot of it comes in practical joking and, you know, and having the laughs with each other. So, you know, you referenced drinking. So when I was going to school in Vermont, the drinking age was 18. And in downtown Burlington, there were 42 bars. So obviously there was a fair amount of student drinking. For us on the ambulance squad in the fire department, you know, we were on duty most of the time. So we really didn't have the opportunities for, you know, a great deal of alcoholic consumption. I did tend to get downtown periodically to go to something called Irish Happy Hour. I'm not Irish, but I enjoy fiddle and a bass and wonderful Irish folk songs. I touch on a variety of the ways that we dealt with stress. One of my favorite stories is the story of the Uzi squirt guns versus the fire truck. and that's in that chapter. And we made the mistake, some of us, of taking on people with our Uzi squirt guns who had access to a fire truck and then came back and got revenge on us. And I'll leave it at that. But it's a pretty funny story. And it's an example of kind of the hijinks that we engaged in when we weren't on duty that helped us to relieve stress.
Right. And you also, I mean, talking about drinking, like God smiles on drunks and babies, like you handled so many different cases. I didn't know that you handled psych cases and premature baby cases. Can you talk about some of those cases, maybe people or situations people might not have heard about?
Sure. So we were one of the only ambulances in Vermont for quite some time that handled the transportation of premature babies. So they would be born, in cottage hospitals in really small towns like upstate New York or New Hampshire. And so we would have a crew, and these are college age students, who are EMTs, firefighters, who would get in the ambulance, usually in the middle of the night. We did about 110 calls a year. We would drive to the Medical Center Hospital of Vermont to the NICU, the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, pick up an isolate, a doctor, and a nurse, and then head off to, go get the baby. And I say that it seemed like the majority of these calls came at night and came over torturous driving on slushy, icy roads. But, that seemed to be the reality. Once we got to the hospital, we had to wait 3 hours usually for the baby to be stabilized by the doctor and nurse team. We would sleep in birthing beds or other interesting arrangements, try to catch a few Z's. And then we would hop back in the rig and drive back, often at like 3 and 4 in the morning, to take the baby to the NICU. We saved a lot of lives. And, I have a son who was in a NICU for a week. And I don't think it really hit me until my son spent a week in the NICU, which was probably one of the most difficult weeks of my family life, just how important that mission was. For those parents in these remote hospitals, they probably would have watched their babies die if we hadn't had this calling to go provide this for them. So something I'm very proud of. And I'm sorry, what was the other question?
Oh, just like you said, God smiles on drunks too, right? So you're handling drinking cases and
Yeah, I mean, I say that a bit tongue in cheek, but one of the calls in that chapter, certainly demonstrates it. A drunk patient who, on a February night, wandered in the snowy wilderness next to his car crash until he plunged 15 feet head first down a snowy embankment and stopped like a foot short of crushing his head open on some rocks in a stream there. And by the time we finally figured out where he was and slid down with a backboard and strapped him on and got him out of there, the irony is that because he was so drunk, he, aside from a little hypothermia, he had really no injuries because his body kind of bounced. Now, granted, I wasn't around for the x-rays, but that was one of the stories in that chapter.
Yeah, you couldn't find him the first time and left, and then got called back to the scene after you found him down, or somebody found him down on the ditch. But
yeah, the police had called us, and the first time we all looked around and couldn't find the patient, which was kind of funny. It's like the police had assumed if there was a car there and crashed on the side of the road with the door open, there must be a patient around somewhere. So after we looked around for 20 minutes, we went back to the rescue garage. We were just sliding back into bed, and the tones went off and called us back there, and the officer had found the guy down in the creek.
Right, and a lot of people think that you're the ones who, if there's a person who's passed away, the EMT are the ones who handle that, but that's not the case, is it?
So I think, I've been actually giving this some thought recently, and I think some of the confusion came because in the old days, it was the undertaker who came for patients. So, the undertaker would either provide first aid assistance or they would zip the patient into a body bag and drive them away. But no, I mean, modern EMS, we don't transport bodies. And, I still see this on television, and it drives me crazy when I see the EMTs with a body bag on their stretcher, taking them out to the rig. And that didn't happen. We would transport patients who might be in the act of dying because we were doing everything that we could to save their life. But we didn't haul bodies, although Lord knows we saw plenty of them.
Right. And I mean, what other stories did you came across you did a lot of driving in that rig too, right? I mean, there are tales of you going significant amounts of distances that I was surprised from that area of Burlington, right?
So yeah, I love driving an ambulance. I still have days today where I see an ambulance go by code 3 and I think, man, that looks like fun. I'd love to get back behind the wheel of a rig. It's better than any video game. Especially, if you're 19, it's a real kick. So I trained on the squad to become a crew chief, and then I also trained to become a driver. So driver training is extremely difficult. We would be taken out on a snowy night into a huge parking lot where we would do donuts and practice turning at high speed and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of backing up if you're going to drive a rig. So, backing up into the emergency room bays or backing up into your headquarters. So you have to become very adept at that. When I was training, I was the winner of the Broken Taillight Award because I cracked the rear tail light while I was learning how to back into the garage. And I was presented with a varnished plaque with a grotesquely broken taillight on it at that year's Fire and Rescue banquet, which I took some degree of chagrin at, but it was a rotating award, so I didn't get to put it on my wall. It was given to someone else the following year. There's a lot of stereotypes about driving an ambulance, and one of them is that we drive really fast. And I would say that's actually not the case. That the first ambulance that St. Mike's had was T-boned coming out of the parking lot of a hospital near our school by someone who just wasn't looking and just slammed right into us. Fortunately, we didn't have a patient in the rig, but the crew was injured. We would really take it slowly and cautiously, especially through stoplights. And it was a regular source of amazement to me that I would drive into an intersection and there would just be people there who simply did not register that I was there. And I would have a siren going, and I would have lights going. Occasionally, I would utilize what I called my pointing technique with these folks. I would glare at them through my military sunglasses and point my finger at them from inside the ambulance with the finger held up against the glass. And it was amazing how that always worked. They didn't see my lights. They didn't hear my siren, but they would see me pointing at them and they would stop on a dime so my rig can go past.
Right. I mean, it is amazing. And people have that perception. They think you guys are always driving 100 miles an hour, but that's not the case, right? I mean, yeah. And you still see that today, too. And you learned always to carry a pen and a piece of paper with you, right?
Yeah, I still do that today. But that's the biggest. I like to say for a first responder those are the two most important tools that you have. That if you show up at a car accident scene, and this is not just if you're an EMT, let's say you just see a car accident and you want to help out, bring a pen and paper, talk to the people who are involved in the accident, ask them for their full names, their date of birth, what their chief complaint is. I mean, what hurts, and then are they allergic to any medications? And you can get all that information down, and then when the EMTs or paramedics show up, you can hand them that piece of paper and they'll greatly appreciate it. You'll have made their life a lot easier.
And you that job, you kind of are in a different environment. Like your holidays and weekends are much different than the average person, the 9-to-5ers, right?
Yeah, so I have a chapter in the book that's called Christmas, Easter, and Other Injustices. And it talks about that. So, and again, somewhat facetiously, but we were privileged to be in this organization. We were there to serve, and so we ran a lot of holidays. Thanksgiving, pretty much every year, I was on duty. I lived in California, and my parents decreed that I was coming home for Christmas. But the rest of the year, Easter, Columbus Day, whatever, was on the rig. And as I say in one of the chapters, that it can actually be very relaxing running a week of nonstop duty over Easter break, depending on your definition of relaxing. So, if you don't mind your relaxing day punctuated by car accidents and chokings and diabetic comas, which we didn't, you can also just catch up on your shut eye and see some movies and perhaps go get a nice meal somewhere.
Interesting. You were kind of before the opioid crisis, right? Did you see many drug cases?
Yeah, it's I did an interview with a reporter when the book first came out, and he was asking me about that too. And I think that our crews deal with a lot of that these days, from what I hear. I saw a lot of cases involving alcohol, and obviously people consuming way too much alcohol. We saw some cases that involved cocaine. Most of the drug calls that I went on were acid, probably some marijuana. And it was the acid calls. It was on an acid call that I nearly got kicked in the head by a guy who was on acid. I was down on the floor working on a patient who was having difficulty breathing, and he decided, for some reason, I hadn't even looked at him, that he was going to strike me in the head with his boot. But there was a cop standing next to him, Carrie, who I barely knew at that point, and she immediately sat down very hard on this gentleman, and he kind of went, "Ooh," and she grinned at me and said, "Carry on." And I said, "Thanks," and so continued treating the patient on the floor. But it was only after that, when a good friend of mine, who was a Burlington police officer, received a head injury in the line of duty that derailed his career, that I realized what Carrie had saved me from. She had saved me from a significant injury. So I was very fortunate in that situation. But those are the kind of drug calls that we saw. And the chapter that opens the book after the introduction, that's called "The Double Forking," involves patients who are on acid.
Right. There's two people fighting each other with a pair of forks. Yeah, with weird injuries.
Yep.
I mean, you have probably seen it all, I bet. Even in a fairly rural community, there's a lot, not even in an urban environment, right? I mean, you're still seeing the human condition right up front, right?
Well, so we weren't entirely rural. So Winooski, Vermont is, an old mill town. It's a small city, really. And we covered all of Winooski. We covered suburbs of South Burlington and parts of Williston. And then we also covered rural neighborhoods that went out from there, Jericho, Heinsberg, St. George. We had a 27-mile stretch of the interstate that we still cover. And so you would see a lot of high-speed car crashes there. But yeah, it was an interesting juxtaposition, to go from some of the sadder, more poverty in type calls that we might see in certain city environments, pretty gritty, to go out to a farm and be treating, a patient on the farm who had spilled heating oil on himself and had given himself third-degree burns. He was a farm laborer that happened during the night, or other injuries that could happen on a farm, or to go off to the interstate. I mean, the interstate can deliver some pretty horrific car accidents. So, yeah, we had quite the variety pack.
Well, Chris, we're at about 35 minutes. Is there anything there's a lot more in this book. It's very well written and a kind of very personal first person record of your time behind the wheel. Is there anything you'd like to add or anything I missed?
Well, I would say that for me, I've always enjoyed adventure stories. I've always enjoyed adventures, but I do a lot of reading on World War II. I'm reading a soldier story right now by Omar Bradley. I like cop tales. I just read a book called Boot about an LAPD rookie's first year, and I enjoy EMS and fire tales. So I'd say if you're someone that likes an adventure tale, this is probably for you. I took a look at Amazon it was the day after Thanksgiving, and the book was #1 on Amazon Prime the day after Thanksgiving. And it gave me a happy, cozy feeling to think that people all over the US were curled up on their Kindle reading crazy ambulance tales to, cook off some of that turkey they'd consumed the day before. So, That's my point of view on the book. They're stories that I enjoy reading still, and I would say, if you imagine a primitive tribe from thousands of years ago sitting around a campfire telling each other the touchstone stories of their tribe, well, the stories in this book are the touchstone stories of St. Michael's Fire and Rescue. They're the stories that we would sit around, the Fire and Rescue Bar, the Last Chance Saloon in downtown Burlington, and tell each other, over some beers at the table there. Stories like the double forking, the patient that hid in the closet, the battling dwarves, the time, as my kids say, when Big Eddie and Dad drove Code 3 through the gas station. That's the kind of stories that are in this book. And for the most part, they're fun stories. When I was starting to write the book, one of my buddies, who's a former military medic who served with a Marine sniper platoon, said to me, Chris, nobody wants to read a bunch of sad stories. And I agreed with him. So the stories that I do my best to tell in this book are the funny, crazy, kind of wild ones that'll hopefully make you laugh and also make you cry, like in a good way, like make you choke up a little bit and say, that's nice.
And where's the best place for people to get this? Do you recommend Amazon? Is that the optimal spot?
Yeah, that's probably the best place. You can go to Amazon.com, or if you want to go to www.crazyambulancetales.com, there's an excerpt of the book there. There's the story of the battling dwarves. There's some information about St. Mike's, about me. And then there's a button there that you can click on then to go through to Amazon and purchase the book if you'd like. And it's available on Kindle, in a hardcover, and in paperback.
And is that the best place to contact you as well? If anybody has any further questions, is at crazyambulancetales.com?
Sure. Yeah, they can reach out to me there. And I'm always happy to entertain questions. It's actually been a lot of fun having that contact page there, because I had a lot of people who either ran with St. Mike's or with local fire departments or squads reach out to me. And we've had some fun reminiscing to do together.
Interesting. That's great. Yeah, I find that that's one of the parts of writing a book is actually the contact, because people will link up with each other, whatever the subject matter or anything like that. People might add something or commentary. So it's always good to reach out to contact. And so you can reach Chris Treece for people on audio at Crazy Ambulance Tales. And again, the title of the book, I highly recommend this book, Crazy Ambulance Tales, just published March 22nd, 2022. And the author is Chris Treece. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Greatly enjoyed it.
Likewise. Stay there. Stay there.